Yeah, you see it, right? It's okay?
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. I'll be speaking about the COLREGs Treaty and how to adapt this for fully autonomous surface vessels. And I'll explain exactly what this means. My background is a PhD in robotics, and more recently I did a bachelor in political science with a thesis on regulation of unmanned ships. And I work at the NATO Science and Technology Organization, Center for Maritime Research and Experimentation in La Spezia, Italy. This is work done in collaboration actually with Professor Michel Mudrich that you just heard from. So, as you just saw, I won't be losing too much time on that part. Unmanned ships have been becoming more and more popular over the past few years. We have many projects around the world focusing on the maritime autonomous surface ships. And as Maria just said, there's a lot of interest from the IMO, MSC, legal, facilitation, and other committees. So I won't focus on this type of ships. I'll be focusing on small autonomous surface vessels. Small autonomous surface vessels have been used in research and development for decades now. They are useful for environmental monitoring, border protection, seabed mapping, oceanography, and other use cases. And this is the critical difference to unmanned ships. These vehicles are normally small, there's no space for crew. So it's a new technology, it's something that it's not comparable to other larger ships. Although recent developments include larger ASVs above 12 meters. There's of course less regulatory attention because they are smaller, but nonetheless, they are the most mature autonomous vessels if you compare them to large ships. So they need to be regulated as well. There are some code of practice coming from industry right now, but there are no formal regulations that are in place for this kind of vehicles. However, there has been already one ASV registered in the UK ship register, and they are being tested around the world for different purposes. Of course, one of the critical aspects is safety, and therefore, one of the topics that you need to address as fast as possible is the COLREGs Treaty that regulates collision avoidance. In terms of state of the art, the first legal issue here is actually the definition of vessel and ship. As you know, COLREGs includes every description of watercraft, including non-displacement craft, weak craft, and seaplanes, used or capable of being used as means of transportation on water. And this is the first issue, because these vessels are small, or even the medium ones, may not be used to transport cargo or people. They actually transport just sensors to do their job, which is functional to their navigation and their job. It's not that they're transporting these sensors from one place to another. However, some authors believe that just by transporting sensors, they would fulfill the requirement of transportation. Others instead propose to consider them as devices or equipment. And in any case, some authors propose that the good seamanship principle still applies, even if the whole COLREGs would not apply. That this principle is an overarching principle and therefore should apply still to all vessels. Regardless of this discussion, many authors in the literature claim that their ASVs are compliant with COLREGs, and they have shown this both in simulation and real tests. We are preparing a paper to submit to the World Maritime Journal, World Maritime Organization, University, Journal of Maritime Affairs, and we have all the references there. If you are interested, I can provide you later. However, some questions remain. For instance, what does actually compliance mean when you're speaking about autonomous surface vessels? What kind of quantitative tests should be used to verify this compliance? And is it even fair to use quantitative evaluation when for many vessels you're using qualitative evaluation? As this is a topic for after you actually adapt the rules and after you implement testing procedures to verify this, we will leave the compliance verification outside the scope of this work. So just to give you an idea of what we are speaking about, I have here a picture of one of these ASVs. Some of these ASVs can be fully autonomous. They are mostly remotely monitored only for emergencies. For instance, the wave gliders, which you can see on the picture, crossed the Pacific in a trip of over 9,000 nautical miles from San Francisco to Australia. And basically, these vehicles are pre-programmed, so you input all the routes before the departure, and then you can just sit and monitor them over satellite connections, but you're not with a joystick controlling them all the time. So they are not remotely piloted, they are fully autonomous. They're fairly small. This vessel has around 2 meters long on the surface. And basically, its principle is navigating with the use of wave energy. There's a float on the bottom, and on the top is just solar panels for energy. And the float of the bottom works with the waves, and with this you can have a huge battery autonomy and stay months at sea, fully autonomous. Some authors argue that fully autonomous can actually be more reliable than remotely controlled. And this is because you don't rely on communications that can be easily hacked or jammed. So actually, if you don't have communication in the middle, you have a less one problem to deal with. Moreover, if we address this extreme case, fully autonomous, we are preparing us to the future where we'll have all fully autonomous, let's say. The current technology is able to detect other vessels, both by radar, LiDAR, camera, etc., and even detects what are they doing and if they're complying or not. There is still some advances needed for synthetic voice, for instance, and for the sound detection part. But the literature shows that, especially for the sound sensors, this is something easily to deal with. As I said, there are several companies that sell this type of vehicles, and they even claim COLREGs compliance. Of course, when you're dealing with unmanned ships, the ones that we just saw in the previous presentation, these will take more time to get to the market because their performance requirements are higher, the risks are higher, their potential damages are higher, and therefore they need to be safer in a way. But nonetheless, the regulatory framework should be ready for when these ASVs flood the markets. And as I mentioned, safety is of utmost importance, so we'll address COLREGs. The first thing is that why do we need to adapt COLREGs? This is because when they were written in the 60s, actually produced from 72, but it's based on the previous data from the 60s, they're written taking into account human elements, so there's no autonomy on it. And therefore, they're not written for an autonomous pilot, let's say. There's different approaches that we can take in order to regulate ASVs. Either a formal approach for treaties that do not allow the use of equivalents. COLREGs is an example of that. Other authors propose to introduce one full annex to COLREGs just for ASVs. Others propose to have a fully new code, goal-based, according to the new IMU guidelines for goal-based instruments, like the Polar Code, for unmanned ships. Or you can propose flexible non-binding solutions. However, having separate rules between the manned and unmanned vessels can create confusion and inefficiency. So our approach will be to suggest amendments and clarifications, while leaving technical details for self-regulation industry-led initiatives. We have a kind of flexible non-binding approach that leaves also definition of operational conditions and certification procedures for classification societies and flag states. So the hardest challenge of adapting COLREGs for ASVs are, first, to ensure the same level of safety as unmanned vessels. This is critical for adoption because humans will require that to feel safe, in a sense. or even sometimes you even require a higher standard to the machines than to humans. Of course, translating the principles as good seamanship or ordinary practice of seamen into algorithms is very hard. And defining ample time, large enough, early action, safe speed in numbers is also hard. But this one is actually, can be dealt with, not too hard. It's challenging to pre-program good seamanship because there's many unexpected situations and there's many cases of non-compliance. Even the rules allow for departure of the rules themselves when there's a risk of collision. So it's hard to cover all the situations. But if you use simulation and use of historical data to train artificial intelligence, you can help to implement this principle. Indeed, having substantial training data and simulation engines can help to train algorithms to be ready to decide when another vessel is not compliant and what to do when that vessel is not compliant. There's several works in the literature that show that this is possible. So I'm positive or optimistic that this will be a reality soon. In any case, even if it's not now, we are looking into the future. So this is for when the technology is ready, regardless if it's ready now or not. What is definitely true now is that spatial awareness of an ASV can be superior to human pilots due to the amount of data it can collect and process in real time, and due to the extra sensors that it can use. And having more and better sensors is within the spirit of Rule 5 when it speaks about all available means. So going now into the proposal that we have, I assume that you're familiar with COLREGs. If not, please interrupt me and I can give a better explanation for each rule. The first rule, we believe that there's no need for amendment because it's basically the application rule of to which vessels it applies. And if ASVs are considered a vessel, then this rule doesn't need an amendment. The second rule instead needs a clarification to explain what it means the ordinary practice of seamen for ASVs. And this classification is just explaining that this practice should be translated to algorithms as much as possible by gathering input from experienced captains through simulation, historical data, and machine learning. The third rule, which says to which vessels COLREGs apply and requires the transportation as I defined before, we won't need to amend because even if it's not clear if ASVs transport or not, de jure ASVs are using COLREGs in the state of the art, so we won't need to amend this rule for now. Instead, Rule 3K needs an amendment because it defines vessels being in the sight of one another. So I propose to have for ASVs, the farthest range sensor will be considered to deem a vessel in sight of one another. Meaning, if you have a radar that looks much further than the camera, then you should consider this sensor or other sensors. Also, I'm proposing to introduce a new rule, 3N, that defines what are ASVs. And this definition comes from the ISO Technical Committee on Smart Shipping that is looking at terminology. The IMO actually is using the ISO terminology for the regulatory scoping exercise and wants to update their current efforts based on this ISO Technical Committee. The rule number 4 that establishes when to operate, we don't need to clarify because that's how it also works now for manned vessels. Rule number 5, it's actually the most debated rule and needs to be amended because it speaks about proper lookouts by sight and hearing. And what we need to update here is to add the word artificial. This will allow for artificial lookouts based on cameras and sound sensors. But we won't define artificial. That is left for the compliance process. And that's a very technical issue that we won't define here. Rule number 6 needs a new paragraph, similar to what exists now for radar. So it's basically the same paragraph for radar, but for other sensors. Rule number 7 is a corollary of Rule 5 and speaks already about all available means to detect the risk of collision. So there's no need to amend because having other sensors is just increasing the available means. Rule 8, there's no need to amend in this case. If we think about manned vessels, there's no definition on COLREGs on what's the safe distance or what is close quarters. So it wouldn't be fair to define for unmanned vessels what this means. What we can look at is case law and best practices, also coming from the testing that is currently done, as we saw in Finland, other Nordic countries, and even through IMO guidelines for testing. Rule number 9 and 10 for narrow channels and traffic separation schemes. There's no need to amend either. ASVs can fully comply with this. Rule 11 needs to be amended like Rule 3K was, to define artificial sight again as the farthest range sensor. Rule 12 and 13, there's no need to amend, as they don't refer to any sight or human sense. Rule 14 instead uses sight again. So our qualification is that it should follow Rule 11, definition of artificial sight, without needing amendment one by one rule. Same applies to Rule 15. Rule 16 and 17, again, there's no reference to human senses, so there's no need to amend. Rule 18, neither, for now, there's no urgent need to amend. Here, I want to make an important point, because some works in the literature propose to use one column of this rule, the vessels not under command, for all operations of ASVs. The argument is, if they're not too safe, or if you don't trust the technology, let's just assume that these vessels are not under command, and they basically have priority, and it's a safer way of operating. This is, of course, impractical for the future and for a large and continuous operation of ASVs, so it should be avoided. Rule 19, we have the same point as Rule 14, meaning artificial sight. 19b, as in Rule 8, case law and best practices can inform us about safe speed, and this safe speed will depend also on the size of the vessel, so it has to come from best practices and testing, basically. Rule 19d needs a small amendment to include other sensors. So instead of having just a vessel which detects by radar, the presence of another vessel will let off radar or other sensors. Then this was the general and navigational rules of COLREGs. COLREGs also includes part C, D, E, and F, but we won't be amending these parts because they're more technical. So part C deals with lights and shapes. Part D presents sound and light signals. And although I'm an engineer, I could propose something on this, but these technical rules need consensus from industry. So I believe we are not the best stakeholders to propose something here. There's some proposal in the literature to use the closest compliance possible clause for vessels of special construction. This can be an option for the initial amendment and initial testing, but again, in the long term, it's not the best option. Also, other works propose to have a different set of lights or a small exemptions for a smaller vessel. This could be the case. Part T deals exactly with exemptions, which I believe they should be defined depending on the performance tests. Part F is about compliance. Again, first we need to define who is the authority, the process for compliance, and only then we should address this part. And technical annexes are even more technical than Part C and D, so they'll need to be amended, but we won't be proposing anything on this. The part that they'll need to be digital distress signals, besides the current ones, that will need to be recognized also by many vessels. And there's something that many works suggest is to use AES, the Automatic Information System, for ASVs. AES is mandatory for cargo ships over 300 tons and for all passenger ships according to the SOLID Convention, Safety of Life at Sea. And it could help to detect ASVs at sea and to even interact between manned and unmanned vessels. So we also recommend this AES. Finally, this was an interdisciplinary study looking at COLREGs from the legal and technical perspectives. We tried to fuse both backgrounds and look at it from both backgrounds. It's important to notice that these small, fully autonomous ASVs can be found in the market, so there is an urgent need to regulate these technologies. Moreover, manufacturers claim compliance, but we need to define what is compliance and to adapt the rules to make sure that they are actually fitting these ASVs. Our goal is to contribute to the debate on how to regulate ASVs, and in future work we will address remotely piloted vessels, which bring new issues as the fact that there's a human in the loop, the communications reliability, cybersecurity, etc. So I'd like to thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Many thanks, Fausto. Thank you for a very, very detailed look in what the actual adaptation of a particular legal instrument might look like and might be. And I have to say, when we first talked about this issue, hearing about this from an engineering perspective really changed some of the things that I look at as a simple lawyer. So many thanks again, Fausto.